I think a start to that would be if you're the chair of appropriations and you don't hit the deadline with this process that I would modify, you're fired as chairman.
I like that.
I mean, there has to be accountability. We don't even fire the chairman when they fail. Mm-hmm. So I think at that level, like, I wanted to see whomever became speaker to say, we will do a real appropriations process and we will pass all of our funding on time with a approved budget that passes with the majority of Republicans, since we're the majority, or I will first fire the chairman of appropriations and then I will resign as speaker. That would be accountability.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 303rd episode of the listener-supported Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is going to be a little different from what you're used to. In general, when I'm recording this podcast, it is either me reading a bill or a law and telling you what's in it, because no one does that, or I'm watching hearings, either a hearing or a series of hearings, and giving you the highlights, because sitting through those is incredibly long and boring, especially things like the January 6th committee, which was 20 hours of testimony. Most of that you did not need. So I like to cut out the fluff and give you that kind of information. But very rarely am I interviewing members of Congress because I don't know any. And because I'm not a DC creature. I don't live there. I've been there as a tourist a couple of times. But I think one of the things that makes this podcast different and special is that I'm not an insider. I don't think the way they do. I am a taxpayer just like you are, who wants to know what they're doing with my money and in my name. And so I do everything that I do for this podcast from afar. But for about 8 days this year, I got to be a DC insider. And boy, was that weird. But the House of Representatives had deemed me worthy of a journalistic credential to both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. And when I found myself in there, I kind of felt like I should do something. So I interviewed members of Congress. And I didn't really want to get political with these people. And I think one of the reasons that I haven't played these interviews for you yet is as I was walking away from these conversations, my brain just kept focusing on how often these members of Congress made these conversations political, because my goal was to really ask them, you know, you're in Congress. What is that like? And what do you think are the problems? We all know it's dysfunctional, right? So it's like, you're in the building. Can you tell me more about what's happening there from the inside? And there were too many times where the answer basically was, well, the other party is the problem, obviously. And so I didn't find any of that interesting. And so I was kind of annoyed with what I got from my interviews. And I've been sitting on them now for months, because the Republican National Convention was in July and the Democratic National Convention was in August. And I'm recording this at the end of October. But over this past weekend, I took an unexpected trip. And during that trip, I had about 6 hours where I just had to sit on a plane doing nothing. And I had all of these interviews recorded on my phone. And so I listened to the interviews again. And upon hearing them, even though the partisanship did sneak in, I actually did get some really interesting answers. And so what I'm going to do with this episode is I'm going to give you the highlights from those 9 interviews that I did. But one of the things that I always do here for Congressional Dish is I give you where my sources come from, right? But this is the first time that my sources aren't coming from a hearing or a bill. So it's really hard for you to give me my sources when the sources are these interviews that are on my phone. And so what I've also decided to do is, starting after the election, because I need some time to put this together, but starting after the election, I'm going to just give you all 9 of these interviews, but I'm also going to add, the gossip about it. So I'll tell you the stories of how I met these people and what I really think of them, because I'm going to keep I'm going to keep some of those thoughts off of the public feed. I don't think they're needed because I'll tell you this much. None of these people that I talked to, all 9 of them, none of them were monsters. None of them were so awful that I feel like you have to vote them out right now. Like I kind of feel like we have to vote out everyone in Congress. I have felt like that for a very long time, that we need to clean house. And some of these people are perfect examples of that. Some of these people are not. I actually really liked a few of them. And so I'm much more willing to tell the people who pay me to do this podcast all of the juicy stuff. So I will do that over the course of 9 weeks. So that's how I will give you the sources and the gossip. And if you want access to that, please support the show on Patreon. You get charged on Patreon per episode, at least for now, but that is not going to be changing before the end of the year. So yeah, sign up for Patreon. You'll get access to the private feed. And then after the election, 1 day per week, I will drop another interview from the RNC and DNC. But today I'll give you the highlights. And I do think you'll enjoy it because apparently I'm better at this than I thought it was. And so yeah, let's get started. And I'd like to get us started with the beginning of my interview with Representative Michael Cloud, who is a Republican from Southern Texas.
So you told me off the air that you've been in Congress for approximately 6 years.
It's about 6 years and a week, actually, but yes.
Okay, but who's counting?
Who's counting? Yeah.
My question is, what has surprised you being someone who's now inside the building? Like, you obviously dreamed of being in the building. What surprised you once you got in?
Well, I knew it was going to be different. I knew it was going to be something I had to figure out. A lot of people ask me, what surprised you, in the sense like I didn't have a preset expectation. I knew it was messed up. You knew it was dysfunctional. And so it was just finding the pockets of dysfunction and where they are. I will say how deep and entrenched the dysfunction is, and then also the layers of corruption that are there. Was certainly disappointing. And when you come from the private sector, you're also used to a certain ROI on your effort. You put forth a certain amount of effort and you expect somewhat of a return. And in Congress, it takes so much more work to move the needle, even just a little bit. And so that can be frustrating if you don't just take time to remember why you're there, and to stay focused on, for me, why I feel called to be there.
It was interesting to me that he talked about feeling called to be there, because that also followed with something that Representative Beth Van Dyne, who's also a Republican representative from Texas, told me about why she felt called to be there.
I first got involved in politics back when my daughter was born. So she was born, she had 9 surgeries on her eye, and she had a really hard time when she went outside with the sun. Yeah. So I went to our Parks Board and I wanted to see if we could get some shade. And I went back to our Parks Board and I wanted to see if we could get some shade. Just shade in the park. Yeah. And what I ended up doing is becoming the Parks Committee chairman. Okay. And I built the park, and I got hundreds of volunteers to come. Took my daughter, who was about 2 at the time, and I went, with her on my hip, and we fundraised, and we built a brand new park. And it was a great opportunity to say, we can all bitch and moan and complain. We can all criticize. But do you have a solution, and are you willing to fight and be part of that solution? Yeah. And it took, a year to get it built. But it was something that I could actually legitimately say we did. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just me. I mean, it took hundreds of people. It took businesses getting behind us and supporting us. And then a few months later, there was a city council election. There's a city council issue. It was a zoning issue that I went to the city council and I watched how it actually worked, and I was appalled. And so without having backing, without having money, without having name ID, without having a political party behind me, I decided I was going to support whoever was going to run against this one particular council member. Nobody wanted to, so I stepped up. I had a 2 and a 5-year-old at the time. It was not a good time to run. I think the question that you had asked was regarding to why I ran.
How you deal with the vitriol.
Well, it's being part of the solution and recognizing that you can actually get stuff done, and the importance of having just one voice and one person who's determined, that has a vision that can get other people behind them. Yeah. And so I was on city council for 6 years, then I was mayor for 6 years. that I worked for the Trump administration for 2.5 years under a great man in Ben Carson.
Okay.
And I really got to see when I first started under the administration, we had Hurricane Harvey that happened in Texas. And again, it was having the connections with the local elected officials, the county judges, Texas Municipal League, and knowing how to pull all of this stuff together. And recognize that a lot of being in politics is being able to actually know who to go to for what when you need it. Having those relationships before you've ever had to ask for a favor. And knowing, what level of government does what. And is it possible to get things done and how to get things done? So many of us, when we first get elected, kind of have to fight the minutia, figuring out where the bathrooms are, right, in Congress, but then also figuring out how do you get these great policies, these great bills, through. And I figured that when I was running that it brought a unique perspective. Having been a local elected official, having been a mom, having been within the federal bureaucracy and seeing firsthand how crazy it is and the regulations and the red tape and how the bureaucrats really don't care who's in office. They're going to do what they do and there's no accountability there. I figured that was a really good, unique experience that I brought to the table when I ran for Congress.
I really liked that perspective, especially after talking to Michael Cloud and some other representatives who kind of said the same thing. Like they're in a dysfunctional body and they were frustrated with how much work they were actually able to get done. And in fact, you'll hear it in a second. Representative Van Dyne had the same frustrations, but the way that she was able to take her position in Congress and make things work for her district locally is a perspective that I feel like I don't generally have. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind. And just the reason that she ran, like it all started local and then she just kind of went up and up and up from there, but is still using the power that she has in this office, even though she's brand new. And I had never heard of her before. And so this isn't one of the leadership people, but she's still finding a way to use the power that she has in this dysfunctional body to make things better for people at home. So I just love that perspective. And I also want to share this with you from Representative Van Dyne.
When you got to Congress, what surprised you the most?
How little time is actually spent on policy. People ask me, well, how, with all these bills that you've had put in, how is it that only so few have ever actually even been brought up on the floor or that have been voted into law? And when you think about it, you're usually in session on an average month, 3 weeks out of the month. 4 days in that week. Fly in, fly out days. So you really only have 2 days in each week that you are in committee hearings, that you're in committee markups. So that's 6 days out of the month. And now it's not that we're not doing anything. And anybody who has a doubt about, the work that we're doing or whether or not we're just kind of sitting, hanging out should really follow my newsletter. And they'll see the number of constituent meetings we have, the number of roundtables that we have, the policy briefings that we go to. But it still is not nearly as important as what policy discussions that we should be having. And the way that it's set up right now is when you've got markups, when you've got your hearings, each member has 5 minutes to speak. Typically what has happened is you've already figured out what you're going to say and the questions that you're going to ask before you ever even enter the hearing room. So a lot of times we're also double, triple, quadruple booked. So we come in for our 5 minutes, we get our speech out, and then we leave. We don't debate. We don't hear the questions that have already been asked and the answers that have already been given. So it's not really a productive hearing in some cases because members are not interacting with each other. Now I'm on Ways and Means Committee, and Chairman Smith has been great in kind of thinking outside the box, recognizing that that's a problem. He's been having field hearings, so he's been taking us outside of D.C. into rural America, small towns, where we actually will have hearings there, where the backdrop is not, the marble halls in D.C., but actually regular Main Street, USA, where these people can talk to us and it's not nearly as intimidating. They'll tell us what they think. But since we're all there, we're all listening to each other. We're listening to the witnesses, and we're having really thoughtful interactions and debate. I think that needs to happen more often.
And I'm not going to play this clip for you because it's more information that affects me and not you. But I asked her about these field hearings, or at least I think it was her. I asked someone about the field hearings because one of the ways that I find these hearings that are not on C-SPAN that no one watches is that I read the Daily Digest every day. The Daily Digest is between, 4 and 12 pages. It's the beginning of the Congressional record, and it tells you what happened. It's a summary of everything that happened the day before, including a list of all the hearings. Or so I thought. It turns out that these field hearings are not listed in the Daily Digest. And so the only way, apparently, for me to find out about these is I have to go to the committee's website and poke around in their calendars. Some of the committees have calendars, some of them have lists, but that is the only place where you can find them. Now, the videos are often there. They're often on YouTube. And I don't know about the Senate because she was from the House. But you can find them, but it turns out that they're not listed with the rest of them. So I just kind of found another treasure trove of information. So yeah, it was a productive conversation for me for sure. But it was also interesting for me to hear her talk about the scheduling because I've been raging about that for years, how ridiculous it is that they don't really start working till Tuesday and they're really kind of done on Thursday afternoon and then they fuck off for the whole weekend and then sometimes weeks at a time. You know, they get 3 weeks off for Easter and then they get 2 weeks off for the 4th of July. Like they're just never there. And that was something that she talked about. And then also a retired senator from the other party, a Democrat, also considered their scheduling to be a problem. So here's a bit of my conversation with Senator Doug Jones. He, like I said, is a retired Democratic Party senator from Alabama.
Well, look, I'd been following the Senate for a long time. I was a staffer for the U.S. Senate in 1979 and 1980 for U.S. Senator Howell Heflin. The Senate is a lot different today than it was in those days. A hell of a lot different.
How so?
Well, you don't have the same kind of rules. I mean, they're on the books. But in those days, you didn't have to have 60 votes to get anything done. We didn't have filibusters except on rare occasions. And when they were there, they usually were able to get worked out. It just didn't kill a bill. I think there was more camaraderie in the sense that senators stayed in Washington more. They brought their families to D.C. They were there on the weekends and go back to their states maybe once or twice during the month. Now senators come in on a Monday, get there late Monday afternoon, and they're gone on Thursday. And they're back home or they're raising money or they're doing something. And you lose a lot of collegiality, I think, when that happens. And families don't get to know each other as well. So I'd followed the Senate. I'd worked in a lot of Senate campaigns and I knew how things were being changed. So by the time I got there, I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. But I'll tell you, being able to walk on the floor of the U.S. Senate, just being able to walk on that floor and be sworn in the same seat held by my former boss, being escorted in by Joe Biden that day as a former senator and a former vice president was really something that you just don't ever get over. It was really remarkable.
That's great. So with the changes that you saw in the Senate, do you consider it broken?
I'm not sure it's broken, but it damn sure doesn't work as efficiently as it can. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the filibuster and the use of that, where you've got to have a closer vote every time to get something done, that's a problem. I think that, quite frankly, I think we have too many executive spots that have to be Senate confirmed. We could cut those down. That takes so much time to do, especially in a divided Senate we've got now where it is so partisan that you don't get as much unanimous consent. So there's a lot of things that can be done. I think the filibuster rule at least needs to be modified to make it harder to actually block things. The minority shouldn't just be able to dictate sole control. That doesn't mean necessarily getting away from it, but it does mean some modifications, I think.
And a new member of the House of Representatives, but who also, like Doug Jones, before he took office, had been in D.C. for a long time, he also noted that he thinks that things have not always been this way. Here's Democratic Party Representative Glenn Ivey of Maryland.
I've only been in office about a year and a half, but I'm 63 years old, and I've been around the track a few times. I was a Hill staffer for Congressman John Conyers back in '87. I worked for 3 senators, Regal, Sarbanes, and Daschle when he was the Democratic leader. I did the Whitewater hearings with them. In between, I did the Department of Justice. I was a trial prosecutor there. Had a couple stints with a few American Law 100 size law firms. And I had a chance to practice law extensively too. I left a few jobs out. My mom used to say I couldn't keep a job. But,
Well, it sounds like you've had some good ones.
we made it work. Yeah.
That's
Thank
great. So I was going to ask you, like, what was surprising about becoming a member of Congress, but it sounds like you know the place pretty well. Were there any changes when you went from behind the scenes to being the guy?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the biggest changes from the 80s and 90s when I'd been there to today is sort of the polarization and the hostility among members based on, partisan lines. They're really nasty exchanges. And some of that is encouraged actually by the internet. You've got people, it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who can, go viral with some of the statements that she makes. It really builds her following. And it allows her to make money. She sells merchandise, maybe not as much as Taylor Swift, but I know it's a big revenue stream, and also as a fundraising tool. So you've got people who rise up, they become famous and leaders in the House, not because they're passing legislation, not because they're doing anything that addresses the people's concerns directly, but because they have the ability to go viral and use that to raise money for themselves and their other colleagues.
And do you think that's why they're in Congress? Like, are they actually trying to govern, or is it the celebrity? And what's your vibe with these people?
I don't know what's in their hearts.
That's fair.
I can only say kind of what's played out, at these hearings and, on the floor debates. And that's kind of how it looks. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's just basic things that Congress is struggling to get done now that were automatic when I first got there. I mean, for example, the Republicans needed 15 votes to pick a speaker.
Yeah.
And when I was there in 87 and, in the 90s, those things happened like 60 seconds or something. It's just pro forma activities. And, you just got through it quickly, you swore in everybody, and then you started moving to the legislative business. It took us a week.
Here's another example of that, because when I started doing the show, it was 2012, which was the beginning of the debt ceiling and the government funding debacles. Yep. And I don't see that getting any better from my vantage point. Right. Are you seeing it getting any better, or what's happening on the inside with the government funding process?
Well,
is it fixable? Is it just...
Sure. It's fixable, but it got worse because McCarthy cut a deal where he could be essentially recalled as Speaker. They could call just any single individual could call him up. And Matt Gaetz did that. And for a variety of reasons, he ended up getting voted out. And what that led to was 3 weeks or so of them struggling to find somebody else that they could agree should be the House Republican leader or the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, but I mean, this Congress, yes, is goofier than any of the others, but I've seen so many shutdown debacles going back over a decade now, so this seems more systemic than just the lunacy of this particular Congress. And so I'm just curious, do you see, if you could change anything, if you were dictator on day one and you could change something in Congress to fix it, is there something that you think you could focus on to help that process? Because, I mean, that seems like a basic function of Congress, is to just keep the government funded. As someone who's been there for so long, do you see any way to make that process, to kind of force the people to do their jobs?
Well, the government shutdown piece is driven in part by sending very extreme people to the House of Representatives. And I think that's the result of gerrymandering that's happening in a lot of these districts, especially in the South. And so you're sending people up who are competing to be as far to the right as possible, because if they move to the middle, they get primaried on the other side and labeled a rhino. I mean, I don't know that Ronald Reagan could get elected in some of these House districts these days, and McCain and moderates like that from say 10 years ago. I think well, Mitt Romney.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
He had a vote of censure by his party in Utah for, I forget what the vote was, but it something not really dramatic. We're not creating like socialistic something like just something middle of the road back in the day. But they want to oust him from the party because of it. So as long as they're like that, I think there's a problem with governance, because people are coming from those districts where governance isn't the goal. It's to shut down the government. It's to starve the beast. And, they're not really trying to do the people's business because they think killing the government is the people's business. And of course it's not.
Now, that conversation got a little bit more partisan than I intended, but it is interesting that he had the same diagnosis for some of these people that I do. I've called them government wrecking balls, and he actually knows them and thinks that they think that killing the government is a job worth doing. So I think I might be kind of onto something there. It was also interesting, though, when he talked about gerrymandering as if it's just a problem in the South and just a problem in the Republican states. Maybe he didn't intend it that way, but it's certainly the way it sounded to me, because it's not just the Republicans that do this. The Democrats have gerrymandered a few states themselves. And his thoughts on one of the causes of partisanship, it mirrored those of someone from the other party, Republican Darren LaHood of Illinois. Here's some of our conversation.
I'm curious, do you think this institution of Congress is running well, or would you just clarify it as dysfunctional?
Well, I don't know if I'd put it in exactly those terms.
What are your terms?
Well, I mean, are there times when we are dysfunctional? Of course. Mm-hmm. Probably more times than we want it to be as a dysfunctional? Absolutely. I think the approval rate in Congress is so low because of that. But I will also just take a step back and say, our founders, the reason why we have 435 members of Congress and 100 senators is our founders wanted to dilute power. They didn't want power in the monarchy or the king, so they dispersed power into a lot of representatives across this country. And so anytime you want to pass a law or you want something done, you're going to have to get a majority of those 435. Easier said than done. You couple that with the fact that we are a divided nation. We only have a 2-3 seat majority in the House, 1 seat majority in the Senate. Presidential elections are split down the middle. This one most likely will. So we are a divided nation. So we believe strongly in what we want, but getting that done legislatively is tough. Now, that's just the system that we had put in place. And so it makes it complicated sometimes, very messy when you can't get things you want to get done that you think are easy to get done. But let me just back up and just say, clearly, I think we need to change the way that we operate. I've been very supportive of reforms and modernization of Congress. I'm also supportive of term limits. I don't think members of Congress, it was anticipated they should serve 20, 30, 40 years. That's not what our forefathers wanted. Mm-hmm. Secondly, redistricting has to change. I'm a big supporter of the Fair Map initiative in Illinois. You want to see a poster child for the deficiencies of gerrymandering? Illinois is a poster child for that. It's terrible. Creating all red districts, all blue districts is not good for democracy. And so I'm very supportive of independent commissions that draw district lines. The Democrats in Illinois have ruined Illinois by creating very partisan gerrymandered districts. That's not good for democracy.
So I totally agree with that. From the state of Texas, I know that it's something that is done on both sides. And I remember reading H.R. 1, which was a Democratic bill. Now, it was all kinds of stuff stuffed in there. But I'm hearing common ground, because their idea was to have independent commissions draw the districts. And so as I hear you talk about, you only have a 3-person majority in the House, if you have common ground with representatives on this one thing, what is stopping members of Congress from having these single issue bills? Because it sounds like you could go across the aisle, find plenty of Democrats that would pass independent commissions for gerrymandering, for instance. What is stopping that from happening?
Well, because they want to nationalize that, right?
Okay.
And
why is that a problem?
Well, constitutionally it's a problem because part of what they've said is we don't want the federal government deciding everything. We want states deciding that, right? States are the laboratory of democracies. I'll give you an example. Term limits for state legislators are not done at the federal level. So I think roughly 50 or 60% of the state legislators now have term limits. We didn't say at the federal level all state legislatures should be term limits. So states have done that. I may not like what the state of California does on gun control or on abortion or on a lot of issues, but their state legislatures can make that decision. On gerrymandering, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of states that I look at as examples. For instance, the state of Iowa created an independent commission that draws districts. So if you look at state Iowa, they go down the middle of it and across, they create 4 districts that are drawn along county lines, city lines, and they're more evenly drawn districts. But that was done by the Iowa State Legislature. To take the federal government and say, we want everybody to be the same, I think takes away from that constitutional foundational principle that federal government shouldn't solve every issue.
Well, I agree with that, but why can't we have federal rules for federal offices?
Oh, I don't disagree with you. I think federal term limits should be there.
Yeah, but why can't we have federal rules for drawing
because every state may draw,
districts?
because those are drawn by the state legislature.
Exactly. Which I think is the problem.
Well, but again, election law is another example. Should you have election law in all 50 states it's the same? I don't agree with that. How people vote in Wyoming, let their state legislature is going to be completely different from New York.
And yet you're all serving in the same body.
Well,
so you get elected differently.
But we get elected by people back home.
Yeah.
And so the states are the ones that decide. I'm not in favor of election law on how you set elections, how you do that in all states, because states are different. You got to let your locals decide that they're the ones that are implementing the election and doing it. I have lots of criticisms on how elections are run in Illinois, and that's why I need to change the direction with my governor and the state legislators there to do that. So when you asked the question earlier, why can't we get this done? It's more complicated than that because you have these federal principles of states' rights that lots of people believe in.
So when you say that you're trying to change gerrymandering, you're talking only in your state?
So I have been the biggest proponent of the Fair Map Initiative in my state.
In your state? Okay.
In my state, yeah, to pass the Fair Map Initiative, which would create an independent commission of non-politicians that will draw lines along county lines and not divvying up. I'll give you an example.
Gotcha.
One of my counties I represent has 4 members of Congress, and it's rural. Because they go into there and they figure out what areas are Democrat, what areas are Republican, and so they gerrymander it up. It's wrong. It shouldn't happen.
I know, yeah. We're completely in agreement on that. The solutions are interesting to me.
Interesting was the polite word that I used for bullshit. Because if gerrymandering is wrong when Democrats do it in his state, it's also wrong when Republicans do it in many more states. If it's wrong in one place, it's wrong in all places. But you do need to know that Republicans in the 2010 election executed a coordinated and frankly brilliantly devious strategy called Project Red Map that revolved around pouring money into winning state legislatures around the country, specifically so that the Republican Party could gerrymander as many districts as possible after the 2010 census triggered a redistricting round. And the result was that in 2012, Republicans held on to the House of Representatives despite winning 1.4 million fewer votes. And the odds have been ever in Republicans' favor ever since. And that's why I found Representative LaHood's position so gross on gerrymandering. And I did want to fight him more on this, because I feel like if gerrymandering is wrong, and it is, then it's wrong nationally. But a national law would end his party's unfair advantage nationwide, which is why I found his states' rights argument to be a total crock of shit. And this is one of those moments that's been eating me ever since I talked to him, because I wish I had the nerve to push back harder. But this was like the 3rd time I had ever spoken to a member of Congress, and so instead, I just moved on.
Moving on, one of the other things I'm curious about is I know that you have to get reelected every 2 years. It sounds exhausting. What do you think is the allocation of time that you're having to spend raising money for your next election, as opposed to reading the bills, working with your members of Congress to do the actual act of governing? What's the allocation of time that Congress members are spending between the two tasks?
I think it's probably more complicated than your question, the way that it was asked. If you're a new member of Congress and you just got elected, most likely you're going to have to get elected. You're going to have to raise a lot of money to do that. You're more vulnerable your second election. So I would say newer members of Congress, when you get elected, you spend a lot of time raising money. I would say 50, 60% of your time is raising money.
Oh, wow, okay.
If you've been in, I've been in 6-7 years now. I've built up a good amount of political support back home. So I don't have to raise, I raise money, but I don't have to spend as much time. And so I mentioned the committees I serve on. I have a lot of legislative and substantive work to do on my committees. Intelligence Committee, Ways and Means Committee, Select Committee on China. So for a member like me that's been there 8 years, I probably spend 20% of my time raising money because I'm in a district that's maybe a little bit safer now. I mentioned earlier, it's a gerrymandered district, very Republican. So that alludes to it. So I think it depends on where you are at in your kind of legislative career. And if you're in a tough district, you're raising money all the time. So it's different for different districts.
And as he was telling me this, I remember standing there thinking about the way that he had just described his district to me, because for most of these people, just as like an icebreaker, I asked them about their district. And his description makes me think that it might have something to do with how easy it seems for him to raise money compared to some others in Congress. So just listen to how he described his district.
So I represent the 16th District of Illinois. So it's actually from where we're at in Milwaukee, it's about an hour from here. Right across the Illinois border is where my district starts. So I have 2/3 of the Wisconsin border. I go all the way down to Peoria, Illinois, which is my hometown. So I have central Illinois and kind of northern northwest Illinois, 21 counties. I represent roughly 740,000 people in those 21 counties. Got elected to Congress in 2015 in a special election. My district is the 10th largest ag district in the country in terms of corn and soybean production. We also have the distinction we produce 95% of the world's pumpkins.
Cool. Happy Halloween.
Next time you're having pumpkin pie or a pumpkin latte or a pumpkin beer, most likely it originated in our district. I also represent the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers in and around Peoria. Make a lot of mining equipment, D10 tractors, excavators, engines. So we have about 12,000 Cat workers there. So manufacturing, agriculture, pretty big healthcare footprint. State Farm Insurance is headquartered in my district in Bloomington Normal.
I mean, did you hear that? It was just like a list of the corporations that are in his district. And I also went and looked at our opensecrets.org, and sure enough, he name dropped Caterpillar. Well, that is his 5th largest contributor. He's taken over $82,000 from people affiliated with that company. And that doesn't even include anything he's taken for this election. He hasn't reported any of that yet. He also name dropped State Farm. Well, that's his 7th largest contributor. He's taken over $69,000 from people affiliated with that company. Again, doesn't include anything from the last 2 years. He also mentioned the healthcare footprint in his district. His number 2 largest contributor is insurance giant Blue Cross Blue Shield. He's taken over $98,000 from people affiliated with that insurance company. And in fact, he's taken over $1 million from people in the insurance industry in general. So it's when he's talking to me about raising money, and then he lists his constituents. He listed a bunch of companies that are giving him a ton of money. So yeah, he doesn't have to fundraise that much when he's hauling in those kinds of numbers. And it got me thinking about Representative Michael Cloud, still a Republican, you heard from him already, but he kind of gave me an interesting defense of campaigning.
I think it depends on how you do it. Part of it is we're supposed to be accountable to the people. So if campaigning is staying connected to the people and making sure that you keep that relationship and you're able to hear their voice and those different kind of things, I think that's certainly legitimate and part of the process. I think when it begins to take the place of us doing the homework that you talked about at the beginning of, us looking into these bills and figuring out what's going on, that can be concerning.
I liked that perspective, that positive spin on campaigning, trying to stay connected to the people and make sure that you keep that relationship and you're able to hear their voice if you're talking about me. But does it also become a problem if campaigning is staying connected to the corporations that you think are your constituents, making sure that you keep those relationships fresh, the relationships with our bosses as opposed to us as the workers, that you're able to hear our bosses' voices, even if that means that the policies you're putting in place harm us, So it's like when I look at these companies that he is taking money from, especially Blue Cross Blue Shield, these are the health insurance companies that make money by collecting as much as they can in premiums and paying out as little as possible in healthcare. So if those are the voices that he's making sure that he is connecting with in his campaigning, maybe that connection isn't exactly good for us. So yeah, I think it all just depends on who you think your constituents are. And with Representative LaHood, at least, he made it pretty clear who his most important constituents are. But moving on, there was one member of Congress, also a Republican, but I really loved my conversation with him because he was refreshingly blunt about the realities of being elected to Congress. And he's in a different position than Representative LaHood was, because the committees that LaHood named, the Ways and Means Committee, the Intelligence Committee, those are very powerful committees. Davidson is not in that boat. Davidson is more of one of the, regular members of Congress, not one of the powerful ones. And so his view of what it's like being in Congress, I found this to be just fascinating. So here's Representative Warren Davidson, a Republican from Ohio.
Well, so regular members essentially have no real power except theater. I mean, we do these bills like, oh, we're going to do whatever. And honestly, that's going nowhere because the Senate isn't even passing bills. Generally, in most years, the Senate doesn't actually do appropriations. They've just accepted that they're going to do a, quote, four corners deal. Find four corners in the Constitution. Most people don't even know what that means.
I have no idea what that means.
And that means the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, two of the four corners, and in the House, the Speaker and the Minority Leader, the other two corners. So the top Republican, top Democrat in each branch, the House and Senate, those four get together, and every time we've done this, whoever the Speaker is or the Minority Leader will come back to the Republican conference and be like, guys, I fought so hard, but the four corners wouldn't agree. Like, we already know that. We could have sent an intern over to tell us that. That's essentially useless by whoever's representing our party in those negotiations. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And the answer so far in my 8 years is we're going to shut up and cut the checks. Now, people like me are going to vote no, but a reliable chunk of people are part of the big government, big business coalition that says, oh, we can't disrupt the cash flow. We got to keep cutting the checks.
But if there's 535 of you in Congress, there's four of the four corners. Couldn't you replace your leadership if they pull this?
Oh, how many times have we replaced our leadership?
Well, once, and it didn't go well.
Yeah, and the only time, I will tell you, I mean, the reason that Jim Jordan didn't become chairman is because they knew he would actually break that, or it didn't become speaker, is because the appropriators blocked him. Who blocked Jim Jordan from becoming speaker? Do the analysis. The core opposition to Jim Jordan being speaker was from the Appropriations Committee. You had the chairwoman, Kay Granger, multiple cardinals working against Jim Jordan. They were pushing their influence out because they have the power. They're cardinals. They have the power over the purse. So,
what do you mean by the cardinals?
Well, they're going back to the role of a cardinal. They're essentially like Dominus Omnis, and it's in the bill, right? Or it's excommunicated, not in the bill. They essentially decide what goes into the omnibus because regular committees don't. And even when you pass appropriations language where, oh, my stuff made the bill, well, it doesn't mean it's going to stay there because in the omnibus, that's where the final negotiation is. And wherever that's cooked up behind the scenes, whatever the four corners agree to, that's the deal. That's the power of the purse.
So you guys
So the
really
power of the purse really isn't the 535 people that get elected. The power of the purse is the small group that influences what the four corners agrees to.
And so when you get these bills, you really are seeing them for the first time when you're asked
we're
to
seeing
vote?
a lot of the components going into them ahead of that. So it's not really true to say we don't know anything that's in the bill. The trouble is you don't know everything that's in the bill. So even if you think like, oh, this part was adopted, well, when you read the fine print and finally get the text, you go, oh, except they carved out the most important chunk of it. And they'll take credit with the headline for doing this great portion, but the reality is they ripped the heart of it out. Or on the other side, you think, wow, we got this adopted when it was going through the House version, so it should be in the bill. And then you get it and read through and you're like, oh, what happened? And even sometimes you'll go to the appropriators and say, what happened to this? Well, I don't know. It was in there when we sent it over. And maybe they don't, but maybe they do. But whatever happens in the final text, that's why it's so important that you can read it, and frankly, why it should always be subject to amendment.
Okay, so we're not being conspiracy theorists when we say that these bills are being crafted behind closed doors.
No, they are being crafted behind closed doors.
Okay, that's actually frustrating, but very good to know, because that's what we're kind of assuming. But
and if you want to change it, anybody that says I support a four corners deal, you should just fire them.
Well, I've been saying that for years, and yet the incumbents just keep on coming back. So,
well, look, some of my friends who I think are good and on balance pretty effective would end up getting fired in that scenario.
Yeah.
But you can't reward that. And if you publish a bill at 2 a.m. and you want us to vote on it tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., it should automatically be no. I don't really care what's in the bill. I'm not going to reward that process. And if we want to reclaim the power of all of the membership, that's what we have to do. And frankly, that was a big part of the fight for Kevin McCarthy becoming Speaker. And we got a real, honest to goodness commitment that we have, 72 hours, not a fake 3 days, to read bills. And for suspension bills to get a longer notice on those. And while Kevin McCarthy was Speaker, those things were happening.
Last question. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing in Congress to make it work better, what would it be? And don't say that your party wins everything. I want to know, like, the institution, so that it's protected no matter what person gets elected.
Yeah, I would say that the appropriations process has to change so that it's granular and you have to cast the recorded votes. You can't kick the can down the road. You have to hit the deadline, and you have to have single subject appropriations bills, even smaller than the 12 committees of jurisdiction. And those bills should be subject to amendment.
What punishment would you do if it doesn't happen? Because right now it doesn't happen and it doesn't seem to matter. There seems to be some kind of change that's required to get members of Congress to actually do that. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so, I do think that Warren Buffett had a good idea in saying, hey, any year there's a deficit above whatever without a declared war, then there should be, 100% turnover in Congress, or for the people that vote for this, they're turned over. So I think a start to that would be, if you're the chair of appropriations and you don't hit the deadline with this process that I would modify, you're fired as chairman.
I like that.
I mean, there has to be accountability. We don't even fire the chairman when they fail. So I think at that level, I wanted to see whomever became Speaker to say, we will do a real appropriations process and we will pass all of our funding on time with a approved budget that passes with a majority of Republicans, since we're the majority, or I will first fire the chairman of appropriations and then I will resign as Speaker. That would be accountability.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? He just kind of confirmed a lot of things that I had an educated guess was the case, but to have it confirmed like that by a sitting member of Congress was amazing. And we have a new term, four corners. Never heard that one before, but we're certainly going to start using it, especially because we have another omnibus situation coming our way during this upcoming lame duck. But he wasn't the only one who identified the appropriations process as problematic and had some thoughts about what to do about the omnibus bill. So let's go back to Representative LaHood from Illinois.
One question, I'm almost done. You mentioned before that you're really interested in the reforms in Congress. If you could wave a magic wand and you're congressional dictator, what's the one reform you think would make the biggest difference to make Congress better?
Well, I think we have to figure out a better way to do our budget processing. Yeah, we pass way too many continuing resolutions and we don't get our budget done on time. We need something that forces us. I mean, what I would say is, if you don't get the budget done by October 1st, you don't get paid.
Members of Congress?
Members of Congress do not get paid.
Okay.
So I think you have to have a mechanism that forces members of Congress to do things like that.
Like a punishment if you don't do your job.
100%. That's number one. Number two is, it is unacceptable, inexcusable that we're $34 trillion in debt. We do not have the ability to stop spending money. And that is a problem. And so I think you have to figure out either some type of debt commission, which we just proposed, that's bipartisan, that figures out how do we control our spending. We have an inability to do that. So there has to be forced consequences to that. Again, if you're spending more than you're bringing in, maybe members of Congress shouldn't get paid. Some of these things have to be implemented.
And then going over to the other body of Congress and the other party, Senator Doug Jones of the Democratic Party had some thoughts on the appropriations process as well.
The one thing that I really want to talk to you about is the government funding process, because in the last 12 years, there seems to be an annual crisis, and we're coming up on the next one. And one of the things my listeners and myself are curious about is, did you find that people in Congress were thinking that that process was broken, or do you think they're using it as an opportunity to get things into law that wouldn't otherwise be able to get in?
It's a combination of that. The process is not really broken, and I've said this for a long time, but sometimes our politics makes it appear that it's broken. The process is really good. And you know what I saw in the Senate then, and I think you're seeing it now, between the chairman, and like Patty Murray is the chair of appropriations now. Susan Collins is the ranking member. They work really well together. But then there's so much that they agree on. But it's the devil who gets in those details. And unfortunately, the process is broken before the other bills. What I mean by that is, earlier we were talking about the fact that you got so many filibusters, you got so many nominations. It's hard now to just get a law and have that standalone law passed. It usually has to be put on a must-pass bill, either the appropriations or the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Those are must-pass bills. And that's where we get bogged down. That's where we get in the fight. And at the end of the day, it's not the process that causes us to kick the can down the road. It's the politics, where people won't give in, they won't do some things, and they won't make compromises until we're about in the middle of a government shutdown. And that is just not the way to do business. We need to do this. When I got to the Senate, you're supposed to have a budget by the end of September every year. Okay, I got to the Senate in January, and we were still in a continuing resolution. And I said, what the hell is going on with you guys? This is wrong. Government can't function efficiently, but it is the political process that is really hampering that more than anything. And when I say the process, it's really the partisan politics. A lot of it legitimate differences over philosophy, some of it petty. But I think in the end, we'll get budgets. We always get them worked out. And I always agree, I try to tell people on budgets and just about anything in politics. I kind of subscribe to the old Mick Jagger school of politics. You can't always get what you want. But sometimes, if you try real hard, you just might find you get what you need.
I like that. One last question. If, with the politics being the problem, how do we fix it?
Well, I think voters can do that. We have elections for a reason. And I think that we need to grow that middle a little bit more, and they need to demand more of their political leaders to try to get this thing, try to get things done for them. We get so bogged down in the petty politics. Look what's happened in the House of Representatives in the last 2 years. It's been a disaster. And that's coming from within the Republican Party, okay? Because they, every now and then they got things done because they got the Democrats to help them.
Yeah.
That's the way it ought to be. That goes back to those rules a little bit, where you used to not have filibusters and things like that. You had people working in the cloakrooms to get stuff done. And that's what we need more of. But it takes a lot. It takes a lot of political leadership, some profiles and courage, and it takes voters to demand it. Everybody says it out there. Everybody says it. But at the end of the day, they still vote for their tribe, their team, whatever you want to call it. And they end up putting people in there that just don't always get it.
And I spoke to someone who I think is an example of someone who doesn't really get it. Here's the beginning of my interview with Representative Aaron Houchin of Indiana.
I guess one of the things that we've been shocked by is the appropriations process. We've seen a lot of 2,000-page omnibus bills 10 seconds before Christmas with all kinds of stuff stuck in there. And I think that's one of the things that myself and my audience are really concerned about.
What I would tell you is under Speaker Johnson and under Kevin McCarthy before him, they are trying to get us back to 12 different appropriations bills, no more omnibus bills, none of these more last-minute sort of Christmas deals and Christmas tree bills. And so we have this year tried to go through those processes. On the House side, we've passed, last cycle, we passed 87% of our appropriations bills.
Have to pause her right there. They passed 7 out of the 12 appropriations bills. They did not pass 87% of their bills. They passed 58%. Back to the interview.
Those then go to the Senate where their processes are totally different. Yeah. I can only speak to the House side, but the House side is very much trying to get back to regular order and avoid this last minute, lots of pages of bills. We want it to be easily digestible by subject matter, and you've seen us go through that process. So when I go back to Washington next week, we will have 3 different appropriations bills that will come to the House floor.
dipping back into this interview really quick, I do want to let you know that after our conversation, the House of Representatives passed one appropriations bill. And so right now, a month after the September 30th deadline, the House has passed 5 out of the 12 bills, which is 42% of the bills. All of these are supposed to originate in the House of Representatives. So while the Senate has passed 0, which isn't good, the Senate isn't supposed to originate this. So the Senate could only, if the proper process was happening, have worked on 5 of them anyway, because the House didn't even come close to finishing their job. And so what that means is we are guaranteed to have another shutdown or omnibus situation right before Christmas, just like I said, has been a problem. And she was saying, oh, well, we're trying to do better. We're doing better. Like, no, you're not. All right, back to the interview.
I have noticed that, but the fact that the Senate is such a logjam with these bills, do you see any solutions being discussed or on the horizon? Because this has just been going on for so long.
Well, I have a bill that's been proposed, and it's called the Funded Act.
Okay.
The Funded Act does not shut the government down, but anytime we are not under a budget, an appropriation, it will cut spending 1% every quarter. And so the reason that we would do that is because it gets everybody rowing in the same direction. It gets us all maybe getting serious about getting back to regular order and cutting spending.
Well, I remember a few years ago, was it the Budget Control Act, where that was essentially the idea, that they would cut everything 1%, and then the cuts just went into effect and we still ended up with omnibus bills? I'm curious why you think that the cuts would bring people to the table when they, like, why aren't they incentivized?
Because right now, what the Democrats want to do is just raise taxes. And so what they end up doing is pushing us to a precipice in our negotiations. So one of the things that you don't see is all of the machinations behind the scenes that are pushing us to a precipice. So you'll hear often some members will say, we don't want to get jammed by the Senate. And so this is a mechanism, I think, that can also avoid a jam, because they do not want cuts. A Democrat Senate, they don't want spending cuts. They want to raise taxes. They want more revenue to do more government programs. They want to grow the size and scope of government. What this will do, hopefully, is make them take it seriously, that we are serious about cutting spending and getting our fiscal house in order. We, as a House, are going to continue to send them individual appropriations bills. Right now, the House has passed, I think, 60+% of the federal budget in single bills. The Senate has passed 0%. So while the Republicans are trying to get us back on a path of fiscal sanity, we are trying to get us back on a path that makes it easy to understand for the American people and even our own members when we're passing legislation for appropriations. We do have to have the Senate to work with us. And so I think this November will be very, very important.
Yeah.
It will be important to keep the House and get the Senate and get the presidency. And hopefully this time, when we do have all of those levers of power, we will use that to full effect to get us back on a better path.
So her solution was one-party rule, having Republicans control everything, which is not a systemic solution. That's politics. That's exactly what Doug Jones was talking about. And her solution, her bill, would guarantee the cuts that Republicans want, taking away all of their incentives to negotiate. Because why would you negotiate if you're going to get what you want the longer the bills aren't done? You know, cut 1% every quarter. That sounds like a Republican wet dream. And then, as you heard, she blamed the Democrats and frankly misrepresented their positions on these bills, because they're not just trying to raise your taxes for no reason. It's much more complicated than that. And she misrepresented the House's actions. She consistently inflated the work that the House had done and left out all of the partisan dingleberries that they attached to the 5 bills that they completed, which is why they were not passed by the Senate without changes. The story was bigger than that, but she was one of those people that just kept bringing it back to politics. And by the way, she seems to think that this is how Congress is supposed to function. She seemed pretty pleased with their job performance, because this is how our conversation started.
When it comes to Congress, I'm curious about the institution itself, because my show, I've been doing it for 12 years. I've been an observer. And do you agree that it's not functioning as it should?
I think it actually is functioning as it should.
Really?
I will tell you why. Because the founders did not want the federal government to work quickly. They wanted the members to grind like mortar and pestle on ideas. If the Congress moves quickly, then that can be very bad for the American people. Do we want it to function? Yes, we do. And in fact, we've passed a lot of legislation. We passed more legislation than what the media traditionally reports.
That I know.
So things are happening. As far as the dysfunction goes, I always tell people it's more functional than you think it is, but that's not to say that it is not dysfunctional.
Which is quite a word salad, but she was a really good example of the partisanship. You know, the solution for her was her party to win it all. And she made excuses for the chaos caused by the very common circumstances that we find ourselves in right now, which is a government, a Congress that has different branches controlled by different parties. It happens all the time, and they do have to compromise. So while the other people were thinking more systemically, she was just like, this is how it's supposed to be. Although I do have to mention that even compromise, when it happens, even that can be branded rightfully as a problem. So let's go back to Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio.
Well, when people say that they want more bipartisanship in Congress, that's a lot of things. People say, we should have more bipartisanship. And I always say, be careful what you ask for, because the most bipartisan thing in Congress is spending more money than we have, bankrupting our country, not just financially, but morally, because they want to put strings attached to all the money. They don't want to just send money back to the states on a per capita or per citizen basis. They want to put strings attached and say all these funds must be used this way, that way. They can't be used any other way, all those things. And so it's very coercive. So the federal government has become kind of, in a way, authoritarian no matter what systems you use, because there's so many coercive strings attached to the spending. So in my mind, it's completely undermined our system of government.
But if you think bipartisanship is a problem, doesn't that mean that one party rule would be the solution to that?
No, I think which bipartisanship should you look for? And, for me, one of the things that we've had success on are civil liberties protections, where you've got what's known as the horseshoe effect, where you have conservatives coming together with progressives, and they're both defending, say, free speech or privacy. Mm-hmm. So those, or maybe, not lining up behind endless wars in a bigger surveillance state. So I think the anti-war left is missing from a lot of our debates post-Ukraine, but normally there's a healthy coalition there between limited war left and limited war right. And unfortunately, the center has kind of expanded this idea. They've reached this kind of consensus that says, if we can build a giant security state and do big business stuff, you guys can build a giant welfare state and do big government stuff. And so you have this centrist coalition of big business and big government, and that's what's bankrupting our country. Yeah. So there are bipartisan issues that really are principled and aligned with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but the thing that is really undermining our system of government is this uniparty consensus that says, more wars in more places for the, quote, neoconservatives, and more free stuff for more people for the neoliberals.
And the man has a point. Every member that I spoke to, even the one who said that Congress was operating as it should, had a long list of problems that they ended up identifying. And there was no consensus that I could find on how to fix them, which was really frustrating. The only bit of hope that I got from any of these conversations actually came, once again, from Representative Beth Van Dyne, who's a representative from Texas.
I was on the Modernization Committee my first 2 years in Congress, which looked at exactly how to make Congress work better.
Yeah.
I will tell you, after 2 years of analyzing the problem, there's not a quick fix solution. Whether or not it's overscheduling and having so many things at the exact same time so that you don't engage, whether or not it's the politics and how, when we were looking at the way that congressional districts are created now, are you a solid Republican or are you a solid Democrat? Because then you're going to get the extremes from both ends. Whether or not there's some kind of a gentleman's agreement that we all sign, that we're not going to attack personalities, we're only going to look at policy. There are a lot of things. I would love to see people who get elected that their motivation is to better America, to better their district, to be engaged in their district, and to do things that actually matter and not be so concerned about their fundraising, about their media profile, about their brand, or about what they're going to do when they leave Congress.
Yeah.
I, in my district, listened to my constituents, and one of the first things that I heard was they were having a hard time, businesses were having a hard time hiring people, people were having a hard time finding jobs. Our response to that was not a bill in Congress, was not asking Nancy Pelosi for permission. Our response to that was hosting a job fair. Job fair the first year had 6,000 people that came to it. Last year when we did our job fair, we had 16,000 people that came to it. We had over 400 businesses. We were having employees that came up and said, we're so thankful because we got a job. I mean, we got a job today. There was one gentleman, he was in his 30s and he had a 3-year-old little boy. He just lost his wife. He had worked at a family-run company, and during COVID, the family had to shrink their workforce, and he got laid off. And he was looking for a job to be able to take care of his child. And we were able to connect it with work.
That's great.
That is making a difference. And that is, when you ask me, how do you deal with a fight and how do you handle it? Because it's a hard job. Having those kind of success stories where you are literally making a difference in somebody's life makes it all worthwhile.
So these conversations didn't really give me any hope for the institution. In fact, one of the reasons I've been sitting on these interviews for so long is because they were so all over the place, and it didn't make me feel like we were all that much closer to fixing Congress, to be honest. But when I look at what we are going to be voting for next week, we're voting for one person to represent us in the House of Representatives, and we have 2 senators, but you're never going to be voting for more than one at the same time unless there's like a special election situation. But for the vast majority of us, if you're voting for a senator at all, it's only one at a time. But we'll focus on the House for now. But these people do have power to do things for us locally that really do make a difference in our day-to-day lives, like this job fair does, if we are taking the time and the responsibility to pick people well for our districts, to take the time to go to their town halls. And we've kind of run out of time for that in this election if you haven't already. But you can go to their websites and see who they are and what they stand for, and to see how many town halls they've had and see if they have anything. A lot of these are filmed. See how much they're actually interacting in the community with people like you and I. Or are they the kind of representatives who are just dialing for dollars from those big companies in their districts? Or are they people like Nancy Pelosi who have been in their districts for so goddamn long that they haven't done a town hall in literally over 30 years? We can look on our own ballots for Congress and try and pick more people that have the attitude like Beth Van Dyne, where it's like she knows she's not going to have much power in Congress. She even sat on the Modernization Committee and knows better than most that this is a bigger problem that can't be solved right away. But if they are the type of person who is trying to do stuff for you in your district, I think there are signs of that you can look for when you vote. And then finally, Representative Greg Kasar of Texas. He's actually represents a district here in Austin. He's not my district, but Austin has been shattered by Republican gerrymandering. So his district's walking distance from here. He just doesn't represent me. Although he does, it turns out, exercise 2 days a week right by my house. So I hope I see him again. Because Greg Kasar is a relatively new member of Congress. He was a Democrat. I met him at the DNC. And by that time, he was one of the last people I interviewed, so I was definitely feeling much more relaxed when I was talking to these people. You could probably hear that I was nervous with the Republicans and far less nervous with the Democrats. And that was just because practice makes this stuff easier. But also, he was about my age, and I just felt very comfortable with him. And I also really liked talking to him because he's on the Oversight Committee. And if you are a longtime listener to Congressional Dish, you'll know that in the last Congress, the one that was controlled by the Democrats, the Oversight Committee was one of my favorites because they were doing a lot of consumer protection investigations. So it was the Oversight Committee that had started an investigation into the Seresto flea and tick collars, which are killing our pets and making some of us sick. And the Republicans killed that investigation. It was also the Oversight Committee that did an investigation into the rock and play sleepers, which were the baby beds that were killing babies for 10 years. It was the Oversight Committee that got those taken off the shelves. And so I got to talk to someone who's on the Oversight Committee, and this is our conversation about that.
The Democrats don't run the House right now. You're dealing with probably the craziest Congress I've ever seen in my career.
And I'm on the Oversight Committee, so a lot of the crazy is sitting right there.
I want to talk to you about that because when Carolyn Maloney was the chairman of that committee, we did multiple hearings on the investigations that were happening there, and we're really excited about them. One of them in particular was the hearings about the Seresto flea and tick collars. Do you know anything about this? Damn it. Okay, because just real quick, because I want you to bring this investigation back. They're collars that are for dogs and cats.
Right.
But from what I understand, there were 2 different chemicals, both of them safe, but they combined the 2 to make a very effective collar, but it also sometimes kills the dogs. And so in the last Congress, there was an investigation into this, and those of us who love our pets really liked it. The Republicans, though, not only didn't take the hearing seriously, but then killed the investigation, and then switched the investigations into
nothing but Hunter Biden goose chases.
Yeah, have you guys done anything else?
There's been some productive hearings on pharmaceutical benefit managers, which are these kind of middlemen between insurance companies and your pharmacy.
Yeah. But
other than that, virtually nothing that's been productive. As you said, under Chairwoman Maloney, you had investigations into poisonous, toxic chemicals. There was also investigations into some of the major drug manufacturers that were keeping prices of things like HIV medications, keeping those prices extremely high, even though U.S. taxpayers has helped fund the research for those drugs. And so that actually helped, those investigations helped bring down the price of life-saving drugs. And so as members of the Oversight Committee, we have the ability to hold the biggest actors in government accountable and the biggest actors in the corporate world accountable. Chairman Jack Brooks from Texas actually was legendary for helping take down Richard Nixon for his corruption. But again, what we've basically spent the last couple of years doing is dealing with the oversight Republicans trying to run the Donald Trump for president campaign out of Congress from their congressional seats. And that's just been a real shame because it's a missed opportunity to do good work.
And so there really hasn't been anything that everyone can be like, hey, this is obviously a scandal other than PBMs? Is that really the only thing?
PBMs, I think, has been basically the only constructive, the only examples of constructive investigative work.
That's a good one to be doing.
It's an important one to be doing.
Yeah, we did an episode about it.
And it just goes to show that when there is real work that we can do, that I'm perfectly I'm happy to find out when Republicans are serious about doing real work. My other committee is the Agriculture Committee, where we picked what I thought would be about as bipartisan an issue as you can find, which is there's a large amount of and really troublesome amount of child labor being used in some of our meatpacking facilities. I mean, these are dangerous plants where you have kids, not just, sometimes kids that are 13, 14 years old using dangerous equipment and overnight shifts in our meatpacking plants. And we brought forward some really common sense, simple legislation saying if we're giving millions of dollars to a company to provide meat for this country, and we find that they're repeatedly and pervasively breaking child labor laws from the 1930s, that there should be some consequences. And basically what we heard back from the Republicans is that they were happy to study it. I mean, come on, right? So I would love to be working across.
About it?
No, I mean we really had to try to force those conversations, and they promised to have hearings on it, and we still haven't had those hearings. And so part of why I hope we reclaim the majority is so that we can actually start focusing on issues that matter to people and don't just matter to Donald Trump.
And I guess this is what I wanted to end on before this upcoming election, because this election as a country has been so focused on Donald Trump and now Kamala Harris and the presidency in general. And we all know that I want us focusing more on Congress, but I feel like these conversations reminded me how important Congress can be for our day-to-day lives, you know, because it's like if you have someone that's representing you well and knows how to get stuff done in your district, like Representative Van Dyne did during Hurricane Harvey, if you have someone who's willing to come into the district, get on the ground, you know, there's a representative in North Carolina right now, his name's escaping me, but he's been on the ground in North Carolina doing all he can to get the resources into Asheville and all of those tiny towns that were destroyed by the recent floods. If you have someone like that who's willing to roll up their sleeves and knows the people that needs to be called and knows how to organize people in your district, that can be a literally life-saving thing. And so I think it's important to look for those people on your ballot as opposed to those that are really there to serve the corporate masters. And along those lines, Greg Kasar reminded me of how important it is for committee chairmanships. And I've got to say, it's not a partisan thing to say this. It is just the truth. The Republicans do not do consumer safety hearings. They've canceled a bunch of investigations. And as you just heard him say, like, I didn't know anything about this child labor situation in meatpacking. That does seem like something that should be bipartisan. The Republicans won't even have hearings about it. So if you have to choose between the two parties, I've got to say that the Democrats do better investigations that make more of a difference in our lives, because we've seen it. We now know that those deathbeds for babies have been taken off the shelves, but the Seresto flea and tick collars, they're still out there. And we still have child labor apparently in our meatpacking plants. Like, I want the people who care about this stuff to be in charge of these hearings. I want the people that maybe have to spend more time fundraising because they don't have Caterpillar and State Farm and Blue Cross Blue Shield showering them with millions just 'cause. I want more people like that representing us. And this is our chance to get more of them into Congress. And I'm just going to say it. I'm hoping that we elect more Democrats to the House and Senate. I hate having to do that. But as the host of Congressional Dish, I've promised you guys that I will tell you what I actually think. And what I actually think, especially after talking to these people, is that the committees are so important. They're so important. And so as you go to the ballot box, like, obviously check the people, because if it was a choice between a corporate Democrat and Beth Van Dyne, who's a Republican, I will take Beth Van Dyne every day. So it's always nuanced dependent on the districts. But if you have two corporate people on your ballot, the Democrats do better investigations in the committees. They just do. And ones that I think are vital to our health and safety. And so, yeah, just something to think about. It was, as I was listening to these on the plane, I forgot about the committees. I'm the person that yammers on about this stuff the most, and even I forgot to talk about the committees in the last couple months. So, yeah, it's time to vote. Now I've really got nothing left for you. It's time to vote. Thanks for listening to Congressional Dish. Thanks for supporting. And again, if you want to hear these full interviews, because there was stuff, I mean, I have a lot that I had to cut here. There were conversations about war. And then if you want to hear more of the partisan stuff, I really only played the partisan stuff from Representative Houchin, however you say her name. But yeah, if you want to hear the full conversations, there was more interesting stuff in there. I just couldn't fit it all in this one episode. So yeah, support the show on Patreon, and I will be back with an episode about what we have coming for us in the 119th Congress after I know the results. All right, thanks for listening and supporting. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.